He called my family's legacy a disgusting, leaking piece of scrap. Mr. Harrington, the Commodore of the Newport Yacht Club, stood on the main dock, his white slacks immaculate, his face twisted in contempt. In front of tourists and other boat owners, he declared my trawler, the Sea Serpent, a stain on the harbor's prestige. I felt the heat of 100 eyes on me, the shame a heavy anchor in my gut. It was that feeling, that burning injustice, that pushed me out days later, into a deep channel others avoided. That's when my winch groaned under an impossible weight. It wasn't a net of fish I hauled from the depths. It was a strange, dark web woven from some kind of metallic fiber, and tangled inside were 3 sealed military-style hard cases. They sat on my deck, dripping seawater and secrets. What would you do? Would you have the courage to approach them? Let me know where you're watching from, and hit subscribe to follow my story. My name is Silas Blackwood. I'm 48 years old, and for every one of those years, the sea has been in my blood. It's a legacy passed down from my grandfather to my father, and now to me. This boat, the Sea Serpent, she's not just a vessel. She's my family's story written in rust and salt, her hull scarred with the memories of 1,000 trips out into the gray expanse of the Atlantic. She's 60 years of my family's sweat and sacrifice, floating in a harbor that has long since forgotten what sacrifice looks like. Newport, Rhode Island. For the tourists, it's a summer paradise of Gilded Age mansions and gleaming white yachts. For me, it's a constant biting reminder of the world I don't belong to. A world personified by one man, Mr. Harrington, Commodore of the Newport Yacht Club. He's the kind of man whose wealth is so old it's become a part of his posture. His voice a smooth, condescending baritone that can cut a man down without ever raising its volume. For years, he's looked at me, at my boat, like we were a stain on his perfectly curated oil painting of a harbor. I've felt the sting of his contempt more times than I can count. It wasn't just that one day on the dock, the day he called the Sea Serpent a disgusting, leaking piece of scrap. That was just the day he did it for an audience. The humiliation had been a slow poison for years. I remember a time, maybe a year before, at the chandlery. I was there to buy a new coil of rope, counting out the worn bills in my hand, my fingers stained with grease. Harrington walked in, smelling of expensive cologne and leather, flanked by 2 men in crisp blazers. He didn't even look at me. He just gestured with his chin in my direction and said to the owner, "Frank, are you really letting the dregs of the fishing fleet track their filth in here? It's bad for business." He said it loud enough for everyone to hear. I just stood there, my hand frozen over the counter, the money suddenly feeling dirty. I felt my face burn, but I didn't say a word. What could I say? He owned half the businesses on that waterfront. My voice was a whisper against his hurricane. The incident on the main dock was different. It was a performance. He stood there, his white slacks so bright they hurt the eyes, and he pointed a manicured finger at my boat. Tourists were milling about, their cameras clicking, and other boat owners, men I'd known my whole life, just stood there and watched. "This," he announced, his voice carrying across the water, "is an embarrassment, a blight. I have half a mind to petition the harbor master to have your mooring license revoked, Blackwood. This harbor is for thoroughbreds, not dying mules." The laughter from his friends was like stones hitting me. Each chuckle, each smirk from a passing tourist carved a little piece out of me. I felt small, insignificant. Like a barnacle, he was scraping off the hull of his perfect world. I just nodded, reeled in my lines, and got out of there, the sound of their amusement chasing me out of the harbor. That night I sat in the cabin of the Sea Serpent, the smell of diesel and old wood my only comfort. I looked at my hands, calloused and cracked from a lifetime of hard labor, and I wondered what it was all for. To be a joke? To be the town's living symbol of failure? It was that feeling, that deep, hollowed-out shame, that pushed me out to sea a few days later. It was a grim, overcast morning, the sky the color of slate. The air was thick with the promise of a storm that never seemed to break. I didn't have a plan. I didn't care about the catch. I just needed to be somewhere they weren't. Somewhere my boat wasn't a stain, but just a boat. I motored past the familiar markers, out beyond the coves where the pleasure cruisers stayed. I pushed the Sea Serpent farther than I usually would, into a deep, notoriously tricky channel known for its unpredictable currents and snag-filled bottom. The other fishermen avoided it. They said it was a place where you lose more gear than you gain fish. But on that day, I didn't care. Losing my gear felt trivial compared to what I'd already lost on that dock. I cut the engine, the sudden silence deafening. The only sound was the gentle slap of water against the hull and the lonely cry of a distant gull. For a few hours there was nothing. Just the rhythmic rock of the boat, the gray water, the gray sky. It was a kind of peace, a bleak and empty peace, but peace nonetheless. I cast my trawling net, the heavy chains and mesh sinking into the dark water, a familiar routine that felt hollow. I let it drag for what felt like an eternity, my mind adrift. I thought about my father, how proud he was of this boat. He saw her as a symbol of independence, of a life made with your own two hands. What would he think of me, letting a man like Harrington make me feel like nothing? The thought soured the air. It was time to go in, to face the world again. I flipped the switch for the hydraulic winch. The motor whined to life, its familiar groan a comfort. The thick steel cable began to wind onto the drum, slowly, steadily. Then, it happened. The boat gave a violent lurch to the starboard side, throwing me against the gunwale. The winch motor's steady groan escalated into a high-pitched, tortured scream, the sound of metal under a strain it was never meant to bear. The entire vessel tilted, the deck slanting at a dangerous angle. My heart hammered against my ribs. Snagged. I was snagged on the bottom. The cable was stretched taut as a guitar string, vibrating with an incredible tension. I thought it was a wreck, maybe an old, forgotten anchor chain. My first instinct was pure panic. If that cable snapped, it would whip across the deck with enough force to cut a man in two. If I lost the net, my entire rig, I was finished. Done. I'd be selling the Sea Serpent for scrap, just like Harrington wanted. My hand hovered over the emergency release lever, the one that would sever the cable and send my livelihood plunging into the abyss. But something held me back. It wasn't the weight of a wreck. I've snagged on wrecks before. This felt different. There was a strange rhythmic drag to it, not the dead, unmoving weight of rock or steel. It was a weight that seemed to fight back. Inch by agonizing inch, the winch screamed, the engine belched black smoke, and the Sea Serpent groaned in protest. But the net was coming up. Slowly, the dark water began to churn, and a shape started to emerge from the depths. It wasn't the silver flash of 1,000 fish. It was something dark, something heavy, something that had no business being at the bottom of the sea. In that moment, your life splits into two paths, the one before and the one after. Would you have the courage to risk everything you have, your boat, your very life, to see what the ocean was offering you? Or would you cut the line and sail away, forever wondering what you left behind in the dark? Let me know what you would do in the comments, and hit that subscribe button to see the choice I made. My hand was frozen on the emergency release lever. Every ounce of sense I had, every instinct honed by 30 years on the water, screamed at me to cut the line. Let the deep keep its secrets. Losing my rig would be devastating, but losing my boat, my life, that was the end of everything. The winch shrieked, a sound like metal tearing itself apart. The Sea Serpent listed so far to starboard that green water was sloshing over the gunwale, cold and greedy, trying to pull her under. My knuckles were white. Just a flick of the wrist and it would all be over. I'd go home empty-handed, more of a failure than ever, but I'd go home. But then I saw his face, Harrington, standing on that dock, his mouth twisted in a sneer, calling my family's legacy a piece of scrap. I saw the smirks of the tourists, heard the condescending laughter of his friends, and in that moment, something harder than steel settled in my gut. No, I wasn't cutting the line. I wasn't running away. Whatever this was, whatever the ocean was trying to give me, I was going to take it. I let go of the release lever and braced myself against the wheelhouse. I eased the throttle on the main engine just a hair, giving the winch a little more power to draw from. The boat shuddered, the groan of her old timbers a protest that vibrated through the soles of my boots. Inch by agonizing inch, the cable wound onto the drum. The water directly below the winch boom was boiling, a turbulent mess of foam and dark currents. Then, I saw it clearly, breaking the surface. It wasn't a tangled mess of old fishing gear or the jagged edge of a shipwreck. It was a net, but like no net I had ever seen or even heard of. It was woven from some kind of dark metallic fiber, thin as wire, but impossibly strong. It didn't glitter. It seemed to absorb the bleak light of the overcast sky, a patch of pure black against the churning gray water. And tangled within its strange geometric weave were three shapes, dark, rectangular and solid. They looked like footlockers, heavy military-style hard cases, sealed tight. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't an accident. This was something placed here, deliberately. The winch had done all it could. The mass was at the surface, a dead, monstrous weight hanging just off the side of the boat. Getting it on deck was going to be my job. I grabbed the longest, sharpest gaff I owned, its wooden handle worn smooth by my father's hands and my own. I leaned far over the rail, the boat rocking precariously. I had to time it with the swell of the waves. The boat rose on a crest, and I plunged the gaff deep into the metallic mesh of the net, hooking it. The boat fell into a trough, and the weight nearly tore my arms from their sockets. My muscles screamed. Salt spray lashed my face, stinging my eyes. I was alone out here, miles from anyone. If I went over, that was it. No one would even know where to look. The thought was terrifying, but the sight of those cases, it was a siren's call. I heaved, my back straining, my boots slipping on the wet deck. I got a small section of the net onto the rail. It was heavier than I could have imagined. I tied it off with a spare line, then took a new position, plunging the gaff in again. It was a brutal, primitive battle. Me against this dead weight. For 20 minutes I fought it, hauling, tying off, repositioning. My lungs burned. My heart felt like it was going to beat its way out of my chest. Sweat and seawater ran down my face in equal measure. At one point my foot slipped and I went down hard on one knee, the impact jarring my whole body. I saw stars for a second, the gray sky swirling. The rope I was holding slipped through my gloves, burning the palms. But I held on. I had to. This was it. This was the moment that would define whether I was the man Harrington said I was, or someone else entirely. With one final, desperate pull, it came over. The entire mass, the strange net, and the 3 cases tangled inside, crashed onto the deck with a deafening, solid thud. The sea serpent rocked violently, then slowly, groaning, settled back to an even keel. I collapsed against the side of the cabin, my chest heaving, my body shaking with adrenaline and exhaustion. For a long time I just lay there, listening to the sound of my own ragged breathing and the gentle slap of the water against the hull. The silence felt profound, as if the world was holding its breath. Finally, I pushed myself to my feet, my legs unsteady. I approached the mound on my deck. It was real. Water streamed from the black metallic fibers of the net. Up close I could see it wasn't corroded at all, despite who knows how long it had been down there. It was perfectly preserved. The fiber felt cold and unnervingly smooth to the touch. And the cases. They were made of a thick, black polymer like pelican cases, but far more robust. They had heavy-duty steel latches and small circular pressure release valves. There were no markings, no serial numbers, no logos, no stenciled words. They were completely anonymous. I knelt down, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. What was in them? The possibilities ran wild through my mind, each one darker than the last. Drugs, weapons, money. I ran my hand over the cold, wet surface of the nearest case. It was locked down tight, sealed against the crushing pressure of the deep. This wasn't something that had fallen off a cargo ship. This was hidden, sunk on purpose, and I was the one who had found it. A secret the ocean had coughed up, just for me. I was completely alone, miles from shore, with a mystery sitting on my deck that felt heavier than the boat itself. A secret that could be my salvation, or my complete and utter ruin. You're out there, on the water, with no one around for miles. You pull this from the depths. What do? Would you have the courage to even touch it? Would you dare to find out what's inside? Let me know in the comments below, and make sure you subscribe, because you're not going to believe what I did next. I didn't bring them back to the harbor, not right away. The thought of those cases sitting on my deck, in plain sight at the dock, sent a cold spike of fear through me. I motored to a small, secluded cove I knew, a place where the cliffs hid you from the open water and no one ever came. I dropped anchor there, the boat shielded from view, and for hours I just stared at them. 3 black coffins filled with secrets. The sun began to set, painting the gray sky in strokes of orange and purple. But the cases just seemed to get darker, swallowing the light. I had to know. I couldn't spend another second in this limbo of ignorance. I decided to tackle the smallest of the 3. It was still impossibly heavy. I used a block and tackle I kept for engine work to haul it into the small, cramped space of the wheelhouse. The other two, I covered with a heavy oil-stained tarp on the deck. Out of sight, but not out of mind. Back in my shack, which felt more like a cage than a home that night, I laid the case on my worn wooden floor. The place smelled of rust, damp wood, and my own fear. I tried the latches first. They were solid steel, and they wouldn't budge. They seemed to have some kind of internal locking mechanism. There was no keyhole, no combination dial. It was sealed, hermetically. I went to my workshop, my hands trembling so badly I could barely hold my tools. I came back with a heavy-duty crowbar and a hammer. I wedged the tip of the crowbar into the seam of the case and struck the end with the hammer. The sound was a deafening clang that echoed in the small space, making me flinch. Nothing, not even a scratch. I hit it again and again, putting all my strength, all my frustration, all my humiliation from that day on the dock into each blow. The crowbar bent before the case did. Panic began to mix with my desperation. I grabbed my angle grinder. This was it. There was no going back after this. I put on my goggles, the plastic already fogged with my breath, and pulled the trigger. The grinder screamed to life, a furious, high-pitched whine. I touched the spinning disc to the edge of one of the steel latches. A shower of brilliant orange sparks lit up the dark room, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The smell of hot metal filled the air, acrid and sharp. It took me nearly an hour, moving from one latch to the next, the grinder screaming, the sparks flying, my arms aching from the vibration. Finally, with a loud groan of protesting metal, the last latch gave way. I shut off the grinder, and the sudden silence was overwhelming. I stood there, panting, my heart a drum against my ribs. I dropped the tool and used the bent crowbar to pry the lid open. It opened with a deep, satisfying hiss, like a sigh, as the pressure inside equalized with the world for the first time in who knows how long. The inside wasn't what I expected. There was no chaotic jumble of treasure. Instead, it was lined with thick, black, custom-cut foam, and nestled within that foam were trays. Dozens of them, stacked perfectly, each one lined with deep, dark velvet. I lifted the top tray. It was heavy, far heavier than it should have been, and there, lying in perfectly spaced indentations, was the reason for the weight. Jewelry. But that word feels too small, too common. This was something else. A river of diamonds in an antique platinum necklace that glittered with a cold, fierce light, even in the dim glow of my single bare bulb. Next to it, a brooch centered with an emerald the size of a gull's egg, so deep and green it felt like you could fall into it. There were rings with rubies that looked like drops of blood, bracelets of woven gold so intricate they seemed impossible, and loose diamonds in small velvet bags that felt like holding a handful of pure, solidified light. I lifted the next tray, and the next. It was endless. A king's ransom, a dragon's hoard. It didn't smell of the sea. It smelled of history, of power, of wealth so old and vast I couldn't even comprehend it. I picked up a single gold coin from one of the bags. It was heavy, ancient, a Spanish doubloon, dated 1682. My hands were shaking uncontrollably. I stumbled back and sat down hard on my cot, my mind unable to process what my eyes were seeing. This wasn't just money. This was a story, a lost one. But how much was it worth? A few days later, my nerves shot. I took one of the smaller items, a simple gold ring with a single, flawless diamond, and drove to a discreet appraiser in Providence, a man my father had once used to sell some of my grandmother's old silver. He was a small, quiet man named Elias, who worked out of a dusty back room that smelled of chemicals and old paper. I slid the ring across his desk. He picked it up with a pair of tweezers, looked at it under his loupe for a long, silent minute, his eye wide. He tested the diamond. He weighed the gold. Then he took off his glasses and looked at me, his expression a mixture of awe and terror. "Where?" he whispered. "Did you get this?" I just shook my head. He told me the diamond was an old mine cut, flawless, over 3 carats. The gold was 22 carat. On the open market, he said conservatively, it was worth $60,000. One ring, $60,000. I felt the air leave my lungs. I did a rough calculation in my head, looking at the trays I had left in the case, and the number was so big it felt fake. Millions, tens of millions, and there were still 2 more cases on my boat. The final estimate, the one that I still can't say out loud without my voice shaking, was somewhere north of $95 million. I didn't buy a yacht. I didn't buy a mansion. The first thing I did was walk into the harbor master's office and pay my mooring fees for the next 20 years, in cash. The news traveled around the harbor faster than a nor'easter. Then I bought a brand new, top-of-the-line Cummins diesel engine for the Sea Serpent and had it installed by the best mechanics on the coast. It was the talk of the waterfront. Old man Blackwood had struck gold, they whispered. Found a salvage contract, they guessed. I let them guess. The real satisfaction came a week later. I was on the main dock, polishing the new brass fittings on my wheelhouse, when Mr. Harrington strolled by, his usual entourage in tow. He stopped. He stared at the Sea Serpent. He couldn't hide the confusion on his face. The boat was the same, still old, still scarred, but she rode higher in the water, her new engine purring with a quiet power that was unmistakable. There was no rust bleeding from her scuppers. Her lines were new. She looked cared for, proud. He walked closer, his eyes narrowed. "Blackwood," he said, his voice stripped of its usual condescending boom. It was quiet, suspicious. "Where did you get the money for this?" I didn't even look up from my work. I just kept polishing the brass, letting the silence hang in the air between us. Finally, I looked at him. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just met his gaze and said calmly, "The sea provides, Mr. Harrington. You of all people should know that." He stood there for a moment, speechless. For the first time in my life, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. It wasn't respect. It was fear. The fear of the unknown. The fear that the man he had dismissed as a piece of scrap had suddenly become something he couldn't understand, couldn't control. He turned and walked away without another word. That feeling was worth more than any diamond. Was it smuggled contraband? A lost family fortune, hidden from the world? Or something else entirely? I still have 2 cases left to open, 2 more chapters of this impossible story. What would you do if you were in my place? Keep it all and disappear? Try to find the rightful owners? Or would you be too afraid to even open the next one? Let me know in the comments and hit that subscribe button, because the mystery is only just beginning. That moment on the dock with Harrington, seeing that flicker of fear in his eyes. It wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of the real storm. The kind that doesn't rage on the water, but inside your own head. I had a fortune sitting in a case in my shack, and 2 more just like it under a tarp on my boat. But money like that isn't just money. It's a weight. It's a target. I knew I couldn't just walk into a bank with a bag of 17th century diamonds. Elias, the appraiser, was terrified, but he was a man of connections. For a hefty, and I mean hefty percentage, he put me in touch with a group in Zurich. They weren't bankers, not in the traditional sense. They were wealth managers for situations exactly like mine, situations that officially never happened. The process was slow, methodical, and utterly surreal. Pieces were moved out of the country through diplomatic pouches. They were sold, one by one, in private, invitation-only auctions in places like Geneva, Hong Kong, and Dubai, to buyers who valued discretion above all else. I never saw the jewelry again. I just saw numbers appearing in a newly created, heavily encrypted account. Each transaction was a ghost, leaving no trace back to me. Over 6 months, the contents of that first case were liquidated. The final number, after all the commissions and fees, was $95,423,000. I stared at that number on a secure laptop screen for a full day, and it still didn't feel real. It was a phone number, not a bank balance, but it was mine. My life changed, but not in the ways you might think. I didn't leave Newport. I didn't buy a fleet of super yachts. That would have been Harrington's way. My way was different. I paid off my father's old debts. I set up anonymous scholarships for the children of fishing families. I bought the entire block my little shack was on, not to build a mansion, but to ensure no developer could ever tear it down and put up another glass condominium. The greatest luxury wasn't the things I could buy. It was the silence. The silence of not having to worry about the price of fuel, or a broken pump, or a bad season. The silence of knowing I was truly, completely free. The real turn, the moment that closed the circle, came about a year later. It was the annual Newport Yacht Club Regatta Ball, the biggest high society event of the summer. the kind of place where I wouldn't have even been allowed to clean the fish. This year, however, things were different. The event had been struggling for a major sponsor. A few weeks before the ball, an anonymous donation of $250,000 had saved the event, a donation made by a newly formed Maritime Heritage Foundation, my foundation. I walked in wearing a custom-tailored suit that cost more than my truck, but I still felt like the same man. I just stood by the bar, watching. I saw them all, the men who had laughed on the dock, their wives dripping in jewels that suddenly looked a little less impressive. Then I saw Harrington. He was at the podium, a glass of champagne in his hand, ready to make his Commodore's speech. He began by thanking their generous, anonymous benefactor. As he spoke, his eyes scanned the room, and then they found me. He froze, just for a second. His mouth hung open slightly, confusion warred with disbelief on his face. He saw me, Silas Blackwood, standing in his temple of wealth, looking back at him not with anger or envy, but with a calm, quiet indifference he had never seen before. He finished his speech, his voice a little less certain, and made a direct line for me. "Blackwood," he hissed, his voice low. "What in God's name are you doing here? Who let you in?" I took a slow sip of my water. "I believe you were just thanking me, Mr. Harrington," I said, my voice even. "The donation." That was me. The blood drained from his face. He looked like he'd been struck by lightning. He sputtered, trying to form words. "But how?" "The fishing." I finally allowed myself a small, cold smile. I leaned in slightly. "You were right about one thing," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "The sea serpent was a piece of scrap, but some scrap is more valuable than others. Turns out, my family's legacy was worth more than everything you and everyone in this room will ever have, combined." I straightened up, put my glass on the bar, and walked away, leaving him standing there, a statue of a man whose entire world had just been capsized. I never went back to the yacht club. I didn't need to. The story is a legend in Newport now. The fisherman who became a king. But they don't know the half of it. They don't know about the 2 other cases. They sit now, not on my boat, but in a private, climate-controlled vault in the Swiss Alps, right next to bars of gold and priceless works of art. I haven't opened them. I'm not sure if it's because I'm scared of what's inside, or because I don't need what's inside. Or maybe it's because as long as they stay closed, the story isn't over. The mystery remains. Where did it come from? Was it a Nazi treasure chest, lost during the war? A cartel's untraceable payment, dumped to avoid the Coast Guard? Or something older, a lost pirate horde from the days of Blackbeard? Why was it in that deep channel, a place no one else dared to go? Why was it me, of all people, who found it? The sea gave me a new life, but it left me with a question that haunts my quietest nights. I'm still just a fisherman, but now I fish for answers. So now I'm asking you, do you believe a turnaround like this is even possible in the real world? What's your theory on where the treasure came from? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. Hit that subscribe button because I promise you, this story is far from over. And please tell me where in the world you're watching from. It's good to know who's out on the water with me.